In this neighborhood, the law bends to whoever holds the most influencia, or at least, that's how Karen Blackstone saw it. She proved as much the morning the demolition crew flattened my $2.5 million boathouse and its bridge right before my eyes. No warrant, no notice. She must have thought a man stripped of everything had nothing left to fight with. She was wrong. That day, I held something the HOA could never own, and with one decisive act, their grand clubhouse ended up buried in muck as deep as the grid it was built on. I thought my war was over until police showed up in the dead of night, waving an arrest warrant born from a 911 call that existed in no official record. The first sound came in the pre-dawn darkness. I remember the exact time because I was in my home office once. My boathouse, redesigned by Sarah 3 years before she and our daughter, Emma, were lost to a sailing accident. A deep mechanical growl shattered the silence, the kind only a Cat 320 excavator can make. Diesel fumes mixed with the icy scent rolling off the lake. The vibrations crept up through the frozen ground into my bare feet. I ran outside in nothing but my bathrobe and saw them tearing apart the last tangible link I had to my family. Karen stood beside a black SUV with government plates, her flawless blonde hair unmoved by the lake wind, wearing a coat that probably cost more than most people's rent. At 58, she carried herself like someone who had never tasted defeat or faced consequences. 3 men in hard hats from Bulldozer Construction stood at the ready, and in the SUV, a man in a dark suit aimed a professional camera, clicking away. "Mr. Harper," Karen called over the machine's roar, her voice carrying the smug cadence of a judge delivering a sentence she enjoyed. "I tried the proper channels, but you refused to be reasonable about removing this eyesore. The Homeowners Association has ruled your boathouse violates 17 architectural guidelines and harms our premium community's aesthetic." I watched teak beams hand-picked from Myanmar, designed by Sarah in her final months, splinter under the excavator's arm. This place wasn't just wood and nails, it was a memorial. After the accident, I had spent 2 years recreating it exactly as Sarah envisioned. Every joint, every beam, every perfect angle had been built with the desperation of a man clawing beauty out of grief. Hearing it shatter was like losing them again. "You have no authority for this," I said, my voice calm despite the fire in my chest. I had read the HOA's 1987 covenant and nothing gave them jurisdiction over private waterfront structures built on pre-existing foundations. Karen just smiled. That same cold, predatory smile had forced 47 families to sell below market value in the past 8 years. In her kingdom, dissenters were greeted with sudden code violations, lawsuits, or worse. Then something caught my attention. The suited man wasn't snapping random shots, he was methodically photographing measurements, structural points, and angles, like he was preparing a forensic report. When he stepped out, his briefcase bore the logo of a prominent legal firm. This wasn't just in Homa Terra, something bigger was in play. The final beam fell into the lake with a splash that echoed like a gunshot. 2 years of work, gone. Karen walked toward me as her crew packed up, heels striking the dock still stubbornly intact. "Nicholas," she said, using my first name like she owned it, "this community has standards. Sentiment can't be allowed to drag down property values." She handed me a manila envelope. Inside was a bill of $47,000 for demolition services with a warning, "Pay within 30 days or face a lien." At the bottom, the signature of Building Inspector Brad Morrison. I knew he had approved my plans 2 years ago, calling them a model of waterfront design. Now, the same man had signed off on its destruction. That blatant contradiction meant only one thing: Karen wasn't worried about being caught. Her power let her be sloppy. As the trucks rumbled away, the suited man kept taking pictures this time of me, my reaction, my supposed defeat. But it wasn't the end. Karen had made her first real mistake. Unlike the 47 before me, I knew how to use structural law, legal loopholes, and precision leverage. I stepped carefully through the debris back toward my house, glass and splinters crunching underfoot. Something made me glance back. Through the SUV's window, I saw the briefcase ajar inside, a $15,000 receipt from Brad Morrison, dated 3 days before my violations were recorded. Karen hadn't just overstepped as she left proof in plain sight. Years of unchecked victories had made her careless. She thought she was untouchable. She wasn't. The next morning, I drove to the Wayne County Planning Office, a thermos of coffee in hand, carrying a resolve Sarah would have recognized. Sarah used to say I was most dangerous when I got Systematica, and thanks to Karen Blackstone's arrogance, I was already heading there. The county planning office was one of those drab, bureaucratic fortresses where hope is processed, stamped, and filed away in triplicate. But to someone with the right credentials, it could also be a vault of buried truths HOA presidents prayed no one would open. My marine architectural license and wetland biological planning permit were still valid for another year and a quarter, and I knew exactly which databases to query, which paper forms to request, and which obscure codes unlocked the real records behind sea pines. Tommy Reed was waiting in the lot, leaning against his pickup with the weary stance of a man who had been through this kind of fight before. At 38, his calloused hands and sun-lined face told you he built things that lasted, and he didn't trust anyone who didn't. He'd once been the community architect until Karen had orchestrated his removal under the excuse of overstepping his authority. The real reason? He opposed her expansion projects. "Nicholas," he greeted, gripping my hand like a craftsman greeting a peer, "heard about your boathouse. I'm sorry." It was a masterpiece. His expression hardened. "But I can't say I'm shocked. She's been lining this up for months. You're just another obstacle she needs cleared." Inside, I pulled the development's complete land use records, focusing on the Sea Pines Yacht Club, Karen's personal court, where she reigned like a queen over the marina. The documents lit up every alarm bell in my architect's brain. The property was zoned for environmental education only, allowed to build structures strictly for non-commercial educational purposes, but the yacht club's actual operations, full-service restaurant, private event rentals, yacht slip leasing, and a bustling bar, every bit of it for profit. While Tommy dug out the original environmental impact assessment, I cross-checked it against the latest water quality data from the state database. What we uncovered made my stomach turn. The waste treatment plant was functioning at barely 40% of its intended capacity, meaning untreated sewage was spilling straight into Lake Clearwater. Pollution levels were 340% over the legal limit, and the chemical markers matched the algae blooms killing fish across the lake for half a year. Karen wasn't just bending rules as she was gutting the ecosystem. Then Tommy opened the corporate filings for Pinnacle Resort Development and pointed to the list of shareholders. Third on the list, Karen Blackstone. The same company had been trying to buy up Sea Pines for the last 3 years. Suddenly the pattern was clear: harsh architectural enforcement, relentless harassment, contrived violations. It wasn't about preserving property values, it was about sinking them to force residents out cheap. I used my GIS access to create a detailed overlay showing exactly where the yacht club had crept into protected wetlands, a 2.3 acres stolen from conservation zones, structures thrown up in floodplains without permits, and a deliberately undersized waste system that was built to fail. Every single count was a federal violation. The damage was enough to trigger automatic state enforcement, and Karen had been so certain of her insulation that she'd left her paper trail wide open. As the printer spat out page after page of evidence, my phone rang. The caller ID was unfamiliar. When I answered, a distorted voice filled my ear. "Stop digging where you don't belong, Nicholas. Sarah and Emma died for a reason. You want to follow them?" The line went dead before I could speak. My blood went cold. Someone was watching me, tracking the investigation, and they knew exactly how to cut into the deepest wound I had. Tommy caught my expression. "Bad news?" I showed him the call log. His face drained of color. "Maybe we should quit while we can. Karen's got connections you don't want to meet. People who make problems a broken bar permanent." But I wasn't quitting. The threat only confirmed what I'd been circling around: Sarah and Emma's deaths might not have been an accident. And if that was true, I was already marked, whether I kept digging or not. The only play now was to collect enough proof to burn the whole operation down before they could silence me. I filed a formal complaint with the State Environmental Conservation Bureau before leaving. By the time Karen realized I had gone official, It would be too late to erase the evidence. She'd chosen threats over bribe as a sign she was getting desperate. The fear from that phone call was real, but it brought a sharp clarity. I couldn't take her on alone. If she was willing to invoke my family's deaths as a warning, I needed allies who understood both the fight and the risks ahead. I needed someone who understood both the stakes and the system well enough to guide me through what was rapidly becoming a dangerous chess game. My first call went to Detective Maria Santosa, the lead investigator on my family's case 3 years ago. Maria had always struck me as someone who valued truth over politics, the kind of cop who kept her integrity intact despite the job's constant compromises. If there had been anything suspicious about the sailing accident, she was the one most likely to have noticed the cracks in the official narrative. We agreed to meet at a small diner 20 miles outside Sea Pines, far enough to avoid Karen's reach and her network of watchful friends. Maria, at 45, had the sharp gaze of someone who could separate fact from fiction at a glance, and the careful, deliberate way of speaking that came from knowing the wrong conversation with the wrong person could end a career. "Nicholas," she greeted as I slid into the booth across from her. "I've been waiting for this call. There were things about your wife's accident that never sat right with me, but my captain made it clear the case was closed, and any further digging would be considered insubordination." She stirred her coffee slowly before continuing. "The report says they hit an unmarked hazard in the dark, but the Lake 456 navigation beacon was shut off that night at a routine maintenance. Supposedly." The words landed like a punch. Sarah was an experienced sailor. She knew Lake Clearwater like it was part of her own backyard. She wouldn't have been near that area without a functioning beacon unless someone told her it was safe. "Who ordered the shutdown?" I asked, already bracing for the answer. Maria slid a thin folder across the table. "Captain Roy Brennan, Maritime Police Chief, signed it personally." "That's unusual. Those jobs usually go through the county navigation office." She tapped a photocopy of the work order. "And here's the thing, there's no record of any actual work being done, no contractor invoices, no inspection reports. Just 6 hours with the beacon dark, then back on." By the time I left the diner, I was already dialing Judge Robert Mitchell. We'd been college roommates, and in 30 years on the bench he'd managed to keep both his ethics and his humor no small feat in the legal system. Now a district court judge, Robert had the independence to act if I could hand him solid proof. "I remember your wife's accident," he said after hearing me out. "I also remember thinking the investigation wrapped up suspiciously fast. Bring me something concrete, and I'll make sure it sees the light of day." That night, I sat in what was left of my home office, surrounded by 3 years of grief and 2 days of relentless investigation, trying to stitch together a timeline. Sarah had been an environmental activist long before she was an architect, and she was deeply worried about the overdevelopment choking Lake Clearwater. In the weeks before her death, she had been compiling a water quality study and had told me she was seeing troubling patterns. I dug out a box I hadn't been able to touch since the accident. Inside were her research files, and what I read made my hand shake. Sarah had documented 7 separate sites around the lake where developers had committed blatant environmental violations. Every one of them was linked to projects approved despite clear legal prohibitions. Her notes included lab-tested chemical analyses, photographs of illegal construction in protected wetlands, and the most damning of all, recorded conversations with a source inside Pinnacle Resort Development. That source confirmed the company's strategy, creating environmental crises to drive down property values, making the area unbearable for current residents while keeping the land ripe for luxury redevelopment. In Sarah's last journal entry dated the day before she died, she wrote, "The source warned me Pinnacle has allies inside local law enforcement, and speaking out could be dangerous. But I can't stay silent while they poison the lake and dismantle our community. I have enough evidence now to stop them, and I'll present it to the EPA on Monday morning." She died Sunday night, 6 hours before that meeting. As I was reviewing her notes, the sound of shattering glass jolted me upright. In the living room, I found the front window broken, a brick lying on the carpet. It was wrapped in a note: "Your wife should have minded her own business, so should you." But it wasn't the threat that rattled me most, it was the fact that the brick had been thrown from inside the house. Someone had been there, Someone had watched me reading Sarah's files and wanted me to know it. I called the police. They arrived quickly, but their interest evaporated when I mentioned the HOA dispute. The officer suggested I resolve community issues through proper channels instead of escalating matters. Karen's reach clearly extended into law enforcement. That meant one thing: if I wanted justice for Sarah and Emma, I'd have to go over their heads. Federal level. The only question was whether I could build enough of a case before Karen's people decided to stop me permanently. 3 days after I'd filed my complaint with the State Environmental Conservation Bureau, the call came. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the lead environmental investigator, informed me they were initiating an immediate inspection of the Sea Pines Yacht Club based entirely on the violations I had documented. Mr. Ya. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's tone carried the kind of authority that could shut down multi-million-dollar corporations without breaking stride. Your evidence package is the most thorough environmental violation report we've received all year. Tomorrow at 6 a.m., my team will begin full-scale testing of water samples, soil analysis, structural inspections. We're sending 8 specialists. The timing should prevent any last-minute cleanup efforts. At dawn, I stationed myself near the Sea Pine Yacht Club, camera in hand and coffee in my thermos, ready to record what I hoped would be Karen Blackstone's first real defeat. 3 state vans pulled in, their teams unloading high-tech instruments. Within an hour, the pristine luxury facility looked more like the site of a hazardous waste emergency. 2 hours later, Dr. Walsh emerged, peeling off her gloves with brisk disgust. This is one of the most severe environmental breaches we've seen in a recreational facility, she said flatly. The waste treatment system has been inoperable for at least half a year. They've been discharging raw sewage straight into the lake. Pollution levels exceed federal safety limits by 340%, and we found tributyltin in the water, a compound banned for recreational use since 2008. So the mysterious fish die-offs weren't natural. They were the direct result of Karen's yacht club poisoning the drinking water for 2,400 families. Dr. Walsh warned the damage would take at least 5 years to repair, assuming immediate cessation of all pollution and a strict remediation program. Karen arrived in her black Mercedes just as state officials taped violation notices across the entrances. She stepped out wearing designer sunglasses, projecting the easy confidence of someone used to wiping problems away with political favors. Dr. Walsh, Karen said warmly, hand outstretched, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The Sea Pine Yacht Club has always complied with regulations. I'm sure any issues can be handled through proper administrative channels. Dr. Walsh didn't take her hand. Miss Blackstone, there's no misunderstanding. Your facility has been operating illegally for months, causing measurable damage to a protected watershed. As of now, all operational permits are suspended pending a federal investigation. You have 10 days to cease commercial activities and submit a full remediation plan, or this facility will be closed and demolished by court order. Watching Karen's expression as she read the closure notice was almost as satisfying as the ruling that came later that day in Wayne County District Court. Inside the courtroom, Judge Robert Mitchell presided, an old college friend who valued facts over theatrics. Karen's attorney, Harrison Webb, was a polished corporate fixer, the same one I'd seen linked to the SUV involved in my boathouse demolition. He specialized in burying environmental crimes under procedural delays. Webb opened with the usual flourish. Your Honor, my client has operated for decades without complaint. Mr. Harper's claims are nothing more than retaliation over an unrelated HOA compliance matter. But when Judge Mitchell pressed him on the water data, photographic evidence, and structural violations, his veneer started to crack. Webb had no counter for the chemical analysis, no excuse for the illegal wetland construction, and no permits to show for the club's commercial activities. The ruling was swift. The evidence proves clear and systematic violations of environmental protection laws with measurable harm to public resources. The Sea Pine Yacht Club must cease all operations immediately and be demolished within 30 days for restoration of the wetlands. The gavel strike felt like justice punching through years of corruption. Outside, I caught Webb pacing the lot, urgently calling someone who clearly wasn't pleased with the outcome. That's when it hit me: he wasn't just Karen's lawyer, He was tied to the larger network backing her. My victory had just escalated the fight beyond property disputes. That night, an anonymous email landed in my inbox with a high-definition video. In it, Karen met with 3 men in a Walmart parking lot at 11 p.m., trading thick envelopes. On the audio, her voice was chillingly clear. "Nicholas Harper knows too much about the project. We need a permanent solution like we used with his wife. I couldn't act immediately. I needed to know exactly who I was dealing with." Running the footage through facial recognition software Alex had once taught me to use, I froze when the results popped up. One of the men was Captain Roy Brennan, the maritime police chief who'd personally signed off on shutting down the navigation beacon the night Sarah and Emma died. I confirmed the identity of the second man after some digging. A LinkedIn image search revealed him as Marcus Webb, Harrison's older brother and a senior partner at Webb, Morris & Associates, a law firm notorious for defending large development corporations in high-stakes environmental cases. When I shared the video evidence with Detective Maria Santos at a secure location, her reaction to seeing Captain Brennan's face was immediate and revealing. "Nicholas," she said, her tone heavy with the kind of burden carried too long, "there are facts about your family's case I've never been able to bring up on the record." She explained that 3 days before the so-called accident, Sarah had contacted the department with damning proof of coordinated environmental crimes around Lake Clearwater. She had documented illegal waste dumping at 7 separate locations, all tied to properties Pinnacle Resort Development sought to acquire. Maria retrieved a thick, unofficial file she had kept hidden from department records. Sarah had been scheduled to present her findings to federal investigators the Monday after she died. The picture was becoming horribly clear. Maria went on to reveal something even more unsettling. Sarah's last call to me wasn't her only conversation that night. Her phone, recovered from the wreckage, showed another number dialed just before she reached me, an inside contact at Pinnacle. Using audio restoration, Maria's team had salvaged part of the conversation. She handed me a transcript that felt like a death sentence in print. The source had warned Sarah that Pinnacle executives were moving to silence her and that she should get to safety immediately. They had people inside law enforcement who would ensure there were no witnesses. Sarah hadn't been out sailing for leisure. She had been heading to a prearranged meeting point to collect more evidence that would expose Pinnacle's entire operation. But their communications were intercepted. The meeting was turned into an ambush. Captain Brennan's order to shut down the Lake 456 navigation beacon was no routine maintenance. It was a calculated move to ensure Sarah's boat would collide with an unmarked hazard deliberately placed in her path. This was no accident. My wife and daughter had been murdered to protect a corporate conspiracy worth hundreds of millions. Maria's investigation revealed the scope of Pinnacle's Plan A far beyond real estate development. Operation Clearwater was a systematic scheme to acquire lakeshore properties across 3 counties by engineering environmental disasters, forcing residents to sell for a fraction of the value. Karen wasn't just an HOA president with ambition, she was Pinnacle's Midwest Regional Development Director and had pulled off similar schemes in 4 other communities over the past 6 years. The yacht club wasn't merely a leisure facility, it was a pollution source, weaponized to drive families out while keeping land ripe for luxury resort construction. Maria's evidence even included internal Pinnacle memos discussing the Sarah Harper problem and giving explicit orders to remove the environmental activist before she could go to federal authorities. They had assumed her death would bury the matter. They hadn't counted on her husband being a marine architect who understood both the technical and legal terrain well enough to continue her fight. Harrison Webb's appearance at my boathouse demolition hadn't been coincidence. Pinnacle had been watching me since Sarah's death, waiting to see if I would connect the dots. The most chilling proof Maria shared came from marina security footage the night of the crash. 2 boats were visible near the site, Sarah's sailboat and a larger powerboat shadowing her course. That powerboat belonged to Captain Brennan, and the footage showed it closing in just minutes before the fatal collision. "Nicholas," Maria said, her voice cracking, "I've been building this case for 3 years. But I needed someone with clean hands and legal standing to help me take them down. Your HOA battle gave us the opening to expose all of it." Before we could continue, Maria's phone rang. Her face paled as she listened. After hanging up, She told me someone had filed a formal complaint accusing her of unauthorized investigations and leaking confidential information. She was being suspended, effective immediately. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Pinnacle's people inside the department had moved to sideline her right when we were close to blowing the case open. But Maria had prepared for this moment. She had been quietly collaborating with federal agents. FBI Special Agent David Miller was already pursuing a federal case against Pinnacle for interstate conspiracy and environmental crimes. The files were in federal hands, beyond the reach of local corruption. She handed me a secure phone number. "Call Agent Miller. Tell him Maria Santos says it's time to activate Operation Justice. He'll understand." As I walked away, it struck me that Sarah's death wasn't the end of her mission. It had set in motion a federal investigation, one that was now reaching its critical moment. The takedown of the Pinnacle conspiracy was now in motion, but I knew all too well that Karen and her circle were cornered animals, and cornered animals lash out. With their wealth, influence, and political reach, they were capable of almost anything. The real question was whether Agent Miller's case would move fast enough to keep me from becoming the next unfortunate accident in Karen's campaign to dominate the Sains community. That night, sitting alone in my study, surrounded by 3 years of grief and just under a week of relentless digging, I finally grasped what Sarah had been trying to tell me in that last call. She hadn't been saying farewell, she'd been handing me the mission, trusting I had the skill and resolve to see it through. When I called Special Agent David Miller, the entire trajectory shifted. Within 6 hours of Maria's suspension, I was seated in a secure conference room at the Detroit Federal Building, flanked by stacks of evidence boxes high enough to fill a small archive. Miller was a careful, deliberate man in his early 40s, the kind whose quiet tone came from years of dismantling people who believed they were untouchable. He spread a set of aerial photos of Lake Clearwater across the table. "Detective Santos has been supplying us intelligence for a year and a half," he explained. "Your wife's murder was what first put Pinnacle on our radar, but your recent court win gave us the legal leverage we needed to go after them in full." The scale of the operation stunned me. Operation Clearwater wasn't a single community scam, it was a coordinated, nationwide land grab involving a dozen lakeside towns in 6 different states. By manufacturing environmental disasters and health crises, they forced residents to sell for pennies on the dollar, then flipped the land into high-end resorts. Karen Blackstone had run the exact same playbook in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, leaving a trail worth over $800 million in stolen property. The FBI had been watching Pinnacle since 2019, but they needed an insider's legal standing and technical knowledge to lock the case down in court, and that's where I came in. Miller then showed me something that made my skin crawl. For 3 years, Pinnacle had tracked nearly every part of my life. Phone calls, internet searches, visits to the planning office, conversations with Tommy Reed, even my grocery lists. They'd been waiting for me to either quit, like 47 other families before me, or to dig deep enough to make myself a target. My fight against the HOA had forced them to move faster, and that's when they slipped up. But Miller also delivered the most unsettling news yet. Intercepted chatter revealed that Karen and Brennan were planning a final solution to what they called the Nicholas Harper problem. The method, a staged gas leak, written off as the careless mistake of a grieving widower. The Bureau was racing to secure arrest warrants for 17 people in 6 states, but criminals on the edge act faster than the law. That's when Miller laid out a plan that sounded like it belonged in a thriller. They needed 48 hours. During that time, I'd be Pinnacle's most obvious target, but instead of hiding, I'd use that exposure against them. The idea was simple and dangerous. I would go through with the court-ordered demolition of the Seine Yacht Club, turning it into a very public event designed to flush them out while federal agents documented their moves. On demolition day, I showed up at the yacht club with far more gear than any normal teardown required. Alex had flown in from California with a full live-streaming rig, multiple cameras, professional audio, and a satellite uplink capable of broadcasting to several social platforms at once. Tommy Reed had gathered a crowd of supporters, displaced residents, environmental activists, local journalists, and more than a few undercover federal agents disguised as media. The demolition crew came from Patterson Heavy Construction, a trusted partner in environmental cleanup work for previous FBI cases. At exactly 9 o'clock, Karen arrived in a sleek black Mercedes with Harrison Webb and 8 private security men who looked like they were bracing for a fight. She stepped out in designer attire, radiating fury, a woman who knew her empire was crumbling. "This is unlawful destruction of community property," she declared to the gathering, her voice slicing through the air. "The Sane Yacht Club is an asset to our neighborhood, and this so-called demolition is nothing more than one man's vendetta against legitimate association authority." But I was ready. As the heavy machinery roared to life, I began my live broadcast, a one that would eventually reach over 50,000 viewers. "Good morning," I told the cameras. "I'm Nicholas Harper, and behind me is a building that has been deliberately poisoning Lake Clearwater for half a year while lining the pockets of a criminal network that murdered my wife and daughter 3 years ago." The silence from the crowd was immediate. Then I began walking them through the evidence, carefully compiled with Maria Santos and Agent Miller, detailing exactly how Karen's empire had been built on environmental crimes and human loss. The first bulldozer crashed through the main entrance, scattering Karen's luxury fixtures into a heap of rubble. Another machine tore into the restaurant wing, which had been illegally operating on land meant for environmental education, shredding it into metal and glass. A third bulldozer demolished the boat slips, the very ones Brennan had used on the night he killed my family, ensuring they would never serve that purpose again. And as the building fell, I narrated it all with the precision of an architect and the conviction of a man who finally had the truth on his side. I spoke with the conviction of a man stripped of everything by corporate greed. "This isn't just a building being torn down," I told the live stream audience. "It's the very backbone of a criminal network that's drained millions from hard-working families and contaminated the water our kids depend on." The comment feed lit up, messages of encouragement, furious reactions, and shares that pushed the video across countless screens. Karen made her move, striding toward the demolition site with her security detail. But before she could get close, federal agents emerged from the crowd. Agent Miller stepped forward, warrant in hand, his voice steady with the weight of federal authority. "Karen Blackstone, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, environmental terrorism, fraud, racketeering, and violating the Organized Crime Control Act." As the cuffs locked around her wrists, her expression shifted from rage, to shock, to a frantic realization that decades of unchecked power had just collapsed. The real victory came when the residents of Seepines, who had been cowed by her intimidation for nearly a decade, finally stepped forward. Former homeowners cheated out of their property, elderly neighbors harassed over petty rules, and silenced voices once stifled by threats one after another. They told her exactly what she had done to them. Mrs. Patterson, an 80-year-old widow fined $15,000 for the crime of painting her mailbox the wrong color, spoke for them all. "You turned this community into a prison, Karen, but today, we're free." As the last walls of the yacht club crashed into rubble, I felt a surge of justice, Sarah and Emma's justice. That's when Harrison Webb approached, his face tight with calculation. "You think this is over?" he said, his voice oily with false sympathy. Karen was just a mid-level player. The people above her don't get taken down by small-town FBI agents, and they never forget the ones who cost them hundreds of millions. Enjoy your moment. Tonight, you'll learn what happens to people who meddle in things far bigger than they realize. At 2:43 a.m., the sound of breaking glass and shouting jolted me awake. Flashlights blazed in my bedroom, outlining the shapes of armed officers surrounding my bed. "Nicholas Harper," the lead officer read from a warrant, "you're under arrest for making terroristic threats against residents of Seepines." I was cuffed and led through my living room, noting the heavy police presence, 12 officers for what should have been a routine arrest. It was clear someone had painted me as a dangerous threat. By sunrise, I was in an orange jumpsuit inside Wayne County Jail, wondering how Karen had managed to engineer my arrest while sitting in federal custody. The allegations were chilling. An anonymous 911 caller claimed I planned to destroy the entire Seepines community within 24 hours, supposedly in revenge for my HOA battle. The caller provided specifics: explosives in my basement, named targets, and a timeline designed to create panic. 4 hours later, my nephew Alex arrived, laptop in hand. At 25, he was already a cybersecurity expert at Google and carried the same Harper refusal to be intimidated. "Something about this doesn't add up," he said, setting up in the attorney consultation room. "I've been digging into the 911 call that triggered your arrest, and what I'm finding points to an elaborate setup." His first discovery was the crack in their plan. "I asked Wayne County's 911 dispatch for the audio of the call," he explained, showing me the waveform analysis on his screen. "But here's the thing, no such call exists. In the past 48 hours, there's no record of any emergency call from CPNs. No logs, no operator notes, no SWAT deployment orders, nothing." That meant one of two things: either the entire system had suffered a perfectly timed glitch, or someone had figured out how to bypass it entirely. Then Alex revealed what he'd pulled from my own home security system. The crystal clear footage was about to change everything. The home security footage left no room for doubt. A Karen Blackstone's silver Mercedes was caught parked near the emergency communications relay box late the night before my arrest. "Watch closely," Alex instructed, slowing the video so I could see Karen step out of her car with a small electronic device and a toolkit, moving with the confidence of someone who had done this before. She knelt by the relay box and began installing what Alex identified as a VoIP spoofing system, a setup capable of generating fake 911 calls complete with fabricated caller ID and location data. The plan was both technically impressive and deeply illegal. Alex's deeper analysis revealed that she had placed a false call traced to the address of Mrs. Henderson, a woman who had passed away 2 years earlier and whose home had been vacant ever since. Using advanced text-to-speech technology, Karen had created a convincingly panicked female voice reporting my supposed terrorist threats. "It sounds real," Alex said, playing the audio, "but the digital fingerprint proves it's computer-generated speech." The deeper we dug, the more elaborate the plot appeared. Karen hadn't just made one false emergency call, she'd engineered an entire fake digital trail. The system produced fabricated cell tower pings to put me at various locations, making threats, forged backdated social media posts implying I'd been planning violence, and even bogus purchase records for explosive materials. It was clear she'd been setting this trap for months, waiting for the right moment to completely destroy my credibility. But Alex was more than just a skilled technician. He'd inherited Sarah's determination to go on the offensive. "I've been live streaming the investigation," he said with a hint of pride. "The clip of Karen planting the device has already racked up over 20,000 views. Cybersecurity experts are confirming the evidence, and the story's spreading fast." The growing attention brought in journalists, federal investigators, and anti-HOA advocacy groups, creating enough public pressure that the local authorities could no longer ignore the truth. Then Alex delivered the final blow: a leaked HOA communications from residents emboldened by the mounting evidence. In those recordings, Karen and Harrison Webb could be heard plainly discussing framing me for terrorism as a way to discredit my environmental lawsuit. Karen's own voice was crystal clear: "Once Nicholas is arrested for terrorist threats, no one will believe a word he says about Pinnacle or the yacht club." One fake 911 call, and the problem disappears. Within hours of Alex's livestream going viral, Wayne County District Attorney Patricia Sullivan announced that all charges against me were dropped due to serious irregularities in the warrant process and evidence of prosecutorial misconduct. Judge Robert Mitchell issued a formal apology and ordered an investigation into how fabricated evidence had been used to justify my arrest. That same day, Agent Miller arrived at the jail with federal arrest warrants for Karen Blackstone, Captain Brennan, and Harrison Webb. Their charges ranged from conspiracy to commit murder and environmental terrorism to fraud, racketeering, and impersonating emergency services. 3 months later, Karen's criminal empire collapsed entirely in federal court. She faced 47 federal charges across 6 states: environmental crimes that had poisoned 4 lakes, real estate fraud worth $800 million, the murders of Sarah and Emma Yah, and the high-tech attempt to frame a federal witness. She was sentenced to life without parole. Brennan received 30 years for his part in the murders, and Webb was given 25 years for his legal schemes. In the wake of their downfall, CPNs transformed. The HOA was dissolved and replaced with a resident-run community council focused on protecting the environment instead of policing mailboxes. The former yacht club site became the Sarah and Emma Harper Environmental Education Center, dedicated to teaching local children about water conservation and environmental stewardship. Pinnacle Resort Development was fined $400 million, banned from operating in Michigan, and its seized assets were used to fund Great Lakes restoration projects. Now, as I sit on the rebuilt dock overlooking clean waters, I think of Sarah's last words to me: "The truth always surfaces, Nicholas. Sometimes it just takes longer than we want." Karen thought she could bury the truth under greed and intimidation, but some things are too important to stay hidden. Justice came slowly, but it came fully, and today, the children of Seepings can swim without fear because one woman's corruption met one man's refusal to give up. Ever wonder what happens when someone finally fights back against the neighborhood tyrant? I lost everything, but I didn't stay down. I gathered proof, turned her own tactics against her, and won, all within the law. Your story matters too. Whether you're facing down bullies or taking a stand against injustice close to home, remember, it's possible to win. If this gave you hope, join the Ya Stories community for more real-life comebacks worth hearing.